Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IDB event, Conversation with Central Bank Presidents from Latin America and the Caribbean, a discussion with central bank presidents on monetary and financial policy. This is an open to the public event with simultaneous interpretation available in English and Spanish. For those joining us via Zoom, please use the word icon at the bottom of the menu and choose the language of your preference. Bienvenidos al evento del BID, conversación con presidentes de bancos centrales de América Latina y el Caribe. Una discusión con presidentes de bancos centrales en política monetaria y financiera. Este es un evento abierto al público y cuenta con interpretación simultánea en inglés y español. Tengo el placer de presentar a nuestro moderador, Michael Studd.
I have the pleasure of presenting our moderator, Michael Studd, editor of Financial Times. Thank you very much, Mariela, for the introduction. We welcome you all to this event that I think will be a very interesting discussion with the governors of 3 central banks of Mercosur. And I think that it's a good moment for central bankers of Latin America. And during the pandemic, we saw how central banks of Latin America even showed the world a lesson in their very rapid and resounding response to the pandemic. And I wrote on this in our newspaper. Our central bank was much slower, much less aggressive in responding to these inflationary pressures, and for this we paid a high price in a long-lasting inflation later. So we were envious of the actions of other Latin American central banks. But as in everywhere in the world, there are new challenges, and among them maybe some that emerge are climate change, which is a very important topic for central banks, and surely one that our guests will talk about, independence of central banks. Many central banks in the region, they gained greater independence or de facto independence in recent years, and it's easy to grant independence, autonomy to a central bank during the good times, but when the hard times come, maybe the governments think that it's not such a good idea to have such an autonomous central bank. So we're going to address that topic also, and always the auditing digital currency, new payment systems, and what this implies for central banks as well. So a very rich thematics, and the challenge of the session is that first we're going to have 3 interventions, one for each one of our guests, where they're going to talk about their financial monetary programs. And then we can we'll open the floor to questions and answers for our guests. First, I'd like to invite the President of Central Bank of Bolivia for his opening remarks. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank all the organizers. Very cordial greetings to our colleagues, Carlos, Washington, for accompanying me in this event that is so interesting. It's quite complex, maybe, to try to summarize all the challenges that arise, but I would just try to organize the ideas so that the audience could have a better understanding, highlighting that there are very important challenges and that we have been discussing throughout this whole period that have been a great challenge. And of course, each country has its own characteristics, its own nature, to see how the policies behave, in this case, the monetary policy. And the external context in this sense has been very aggressive for the economies of the region. And just to put this at a short term, everything that resulted from COVID and what would be the real sector through increases in prices, much more active policies by central banks, the largest central banks of the world, the European Bank to highlight some of these cases that have determined, of course, have generated a series of events that our economies, which are small, have to face through this external context. And to this, we have to add the geopolitical aspects. For example, we have the war, which was thought that would last a few days. And in the end, this whole period has been expanded. So all these elements make the external environment to make our countries face a demand for the products that we generate. There's an increase in import prices. The whole supply chain has been affected. So I think that this summarizes what happens in the external context. Now, internally, each economy has its own specificities. In the Bolivian case, I'd say that there's a very important cycle that started at the beginning of this new century that benefits and is accompanied by a very important political process in Bolivia, which is the nationalization of natural resources, which has allowed us to expand the economy, generate policies, develop an infrastructure, and therefore generate economic stability and distribution processes. I'd summarize it that way. However, this process has been seen in everything that is pre-COVID. It's been affected by a series of political conflicts of internal origin that have somehow lost the economic dynamic. And in this last period, the internal conflicts have become more complex, and therefore maybe this has limited the capacity that the economy could have in this external context that I've just mentioned. Now, having said this, Central Bank of Bolivia has a design and a structure of the program, and we actually have a constitutional mandate that started in 2009, where we established a coordination process between central bank, the monetary policy, fiscal policy. I think that this is an aspect that characterizes the performance of central bank. Why? Because maybe it's an intermediate escape in this type of design or dependency on these things. And here we're talking about a coordination process that basically has to do with the establishment of macroeconomic targets in terms of growth, inflation, on the fiscal side to see the whole public investment process. And then on the monetary side, also variables such as inflation, the credit that will be granted to the financial and non-financial sectors that will then allow us to establish operational targets such as the administration of the financial system. So I think that this is an important element that has allowed us to have a good macroeconomic performance, at least until past management, and we've been at around 4%. Inflation has been, is between 4 or 5%, showing us very important macroeconomic indicators. And of course, I reiterate, in these distribution process that has allowed us to improve many of the indicators in matters of quality of life, etc. Now, this year specifically has another type of connotation because we're now entering an elections process, and basically everything that has been the internal conflicts and of course the difficulties in the economy have been increased. But based on these principles that we mentioned, the idea is to establish macroeconomic targets, and we are allowing the economy to be in a process of expansion, having macroeconomic stability. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rojas, for your words. We now give the word to Mr. Carlos Carvalho, President of Central Bank of Paraguay, for your comments, please. Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a pleasure to see you again. You were in our country recently also, so once again, it's a pleasure to see you here. Our friend Edwin, it's a pleasure to share this discussion with you. And also, I thank the IDB for organizing this and for inviting us. Well, along the line of what Edwin mentioned, these recent years have been very challenging. And in Paraguay, we started many years after the important crisis, very profound problems of political economy. We were on the verge of a default, high inflation, governance problems, etc. And from there, construction of economic institutionality process began. I would even dare to be bold in what I'm going to say. I think that politicians were afraid. They saw that economy was bad business back then, and they left space so that technicians could start to develop processes for institutional strengthening. And that continued, and in time, important laws were approved, were passed, and so there's a space that emphatically limits central bank from financing these things. And then the financial crisis was approved in the year 2000, and a series of regulatory standards were passed for central bank, the bank's law, where the same rationale as the autonomy of the Constitution is established. And every member of the board of directors is elected each year, and the mandate, it expires in a scaled way. So what is written in our countries many times does not have the permanence or the same ink that we write with. So we're in our region, we're used to these things, and this defines the process for institutionality in the country is the appropriation by society, which has been a persistent process that is permanent in an Anglo-Saxon way. And I'd say that the repetitions have configured or set up this institutional process, and the country has somehow become used to this, and that's why society demands solutions that go beyond the economic, what economically makes sense. So in the Ministry of Finance, we've appointed people with technical profile, with responsibility in the management of the fiscal policy, and in this case in central bank, technicians are appointed, and this is appreciated by society, and it's basically a custom that is transmitted from government to government, and that has somehow generated that legacy that exists today in the country. So many of the questions that society asked itself, because that perception of institutional strength is something that is abstract, so to speak. So the question was always, well, this whole macro aspect, why are there people that do not receive this? What happens with the micro? And if that is actually okay. And there we had the most severe and global shock that we've had, and where we have statistical data, and the characteristic of severity, seriousness has allowed us to establish a baseline with which we can compare, or to which we can compare the countries. And that's where we realized what this whole institutional construction process was for, and the possibility to, in processes such as that, to have the spaces that are necessary in order to have a fiscal policy in relative terms, and to have a profound monetary policy. And in 3 months, we had the rate to zero, with a series of financial and monetary stimulus so that the financial system can sustain certain aspects. The monetary fiscal process was above 10% of the GDP. And once the shock ended, and once how we started to normalize, well, the situation started to normalize itself, people started to come out, and the economy went back to its growth rate as we had during the pre-pandemic period, when we were 10 percentage points above the GDP. And then after that, another problem came up, which was inflation, which was also a global problem that once again allowed to test the effectiveness of instruments, in this case, monetary. So the countries of Latin America also reacted, and we anticipated the most developed countries that had many doubts on the percentage, and we rapidly saw that this was a process that was going to have its certain persistence time, and then with space so that the monetary policy could have an important role. We saw that what the monetary policy could do was very important. And the countries of the region, except Peru, which I think is the only one that, in this case, exceeded us, we had to have our monetary policy to start to see effects on inflation. Went to 8.5%, and many countries in the region had to increase their own monetary policy, and the cost in terms of monetary sacrifice was very low. We didn't have negative growth throughout that time. And well, if I had to summarize that strength that I'm referring to, we had good results having an independent central bank, responsible fiscal process, and I think that this is very important in countries that still have this. Well, it runs serious risks. A central bank is difficult, and economy market where there's good transmission of information, where people can make important decisions based on optimal levels. And we can also see this in the financial system, because in spite of all the stimulus that was generated in that period so that the financial system could continue to provide credit and sustain an important part of the economy, I think that unlike Uruguay, that had a much more effective health policy.
El riesgo allí era básicamente que
The
la
risk
lectura
there was
del
basically that
sistema financiero fue
the reading of the financial system was incorrect, and somehow those balances were affected
por malas decisiones
by bad decisions,
financieras en ese momento.
bad financial decisions.
Y lo que vimos es que en realidad el sistema financiero
And what we saw is that the financial system has an important reading of the situation, and in those situations where shock was temporary, financed, and others where it was permanent and adjusted, and there's also a role there for the counter-cyclic fiscal role. And that nature, which is in the DNA, is what today allows us, or allows all these processes to today be heading towards normalcy. And this year we're going to finish with a fiscal deficit at around 2.5%, and then next year we're going to have what depends the law of fiscal responsibility, which is basically a deficit of 1.5%. And we have a monetary policy that as of August last year has started its convergence process towards a neutral rate of monetary policy towards our new normal, because I think that one of the characteristics of the pandemic, the shock of the pandemic, is that all the countries we re-estimated our variables, and we had a convergence process with inflation under control, so to speak, since February last year. We have an inflation close to the target of central bank. We've closed 2023 with an inflation of 3.7%, and this year we have an inflation of 3.6% and an estimated growth of around 4%, and a rate for monetary policy of around 6%, where the neutrality range in central bank is basically at around 6.4, 6.3. So this is basically in the range of neutrality. And another fundamental element that I think, to give the floor to Washington also, I think that the effectiveness of instruments also depends not only on the credibility and the correct institutional design, but it results from macroeconomic policies. And also to help the policy of inflation rates that we have in this case, that we believe are the fundamental anchor of inflation in our country and credibility in the monetary policy. People rapidly adjust their expectations to central bank's target, and this also has to do with a flexible exchange rate and with a sound external policy and a flexible exchange rate that accommodates shocks. In 2015, we had a decline in exchange rate of over 40%. There was a depreciation of 25%. Inflation remained at 3.2%. And in 2022, the automatic stabilizer also appeared. But then on the other hand, we had basically a severe climate shock that destroyed around 60% of the agricultural production in our country, which is, for example, soy, which is the main export product. But in this case, the adjustment came from the external sector. And what happened is that the financial system understood and established these positions and through the capital account. So if we let the economy operate in the framework of economic freedom, I think that the automatic stabilizers help these shock impacts that are going to be more and more frequent, climatic or of any other nature, to be transmitted in a moderate way to the economic dynamic. Thank you, Carlos, for your presentation. Very complete. Now I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Washington Rivero so that he can give us the Uruguayan perspective. Good afternoon. Thank you. I thank the IDB for the invitation and for allowing us to somehow contribute to the discussion in this conversation and to share with you why Uruguay's experience. And Uruguay, as well as many countries in the region, South American region, but Uruguay particularly, it really touched bottom through a very profound crisis, and then Uruguay was able to overcome this crisis, I'd say, with a premise which is what characterizes us to this day, which is the commitment with the responsibilities assumed, and a series of laws were passed. No one in Uruguay that has had savings in the Uruguayan financial system, well, maybe this did take some time, and at a level of public debt, a reprogramming process was also carried out, and we were able to comply with our obligations, and this allowed us to overcome the situation. I think that this is relevant. Every 20 years to 2012 in Uruguay, there was a crisis. In the decade of the 60s, there was a very profound crisis because of the situation in the country. There was another exchange rate crisis then in 2002, and therefore we had 20 years ahead of us to work and to avoid the next crisis. And that is how, in Uruguay, through growth, we began this salary recovery process and of jobs, an increase in activities, a change in productive structures, and by prioritizing a change in the energy positioning that allowed us to increase our potential in what we did in our financial system. In 2008, we approved what can be called the first organic letter of the Central Bank of Uruguay, which was founded in 1967 in response to one of these crises that I mentioned. And this first organic letter grants central bank the whole independence that the political negotiation allowed. Not the optimum, but yes, the independence and particularly the prohibition of financing central government, which has an extremely low limit to finance central government, practically zero. The Superintendency of Financial Services, control, regulation, and supervising is in central bank as well as the payment system. And there, as of 2005, central banks set a regime for inflation objectives that went through several phases. And then the interest rate, then in 2013, it went back to monetary aggregates. And one of the quotas or degrees of independence is this lack of reserve in the political cycle. And so in 2020, with this, we had a partial change in the board of directors, and the new board establishes a central objective. Throughout this whole reconstruction process of our economy in 2012, the inflation in Uruguay was like it's like a chronic cold. Bothersome, definitely. Not bothersome enough so that it will keep us from our daily activities, of which we never take care of, but it's always there. And in the past 20 years, counting from 2020 back, there was an average of 8%. The expectations anchored to that 8%. And the target range first at 6% and then at 7%. So permanently, except for certain exceptions, as was mentioned, in which central bank complied with its goal, and that obviously it harmed trust. It eroded it because central bank in Uruguay is the institution that generates the highest level of confidence, of trust in the population, in spite of being public government. And there was a lack of central bank capacity to comply with what it had established. So in March 2020, the new board took over today as I became member as president, as vice president, and we pushed forward together with all the technicians of central bank a new policy scheme, and we defined the interest rate as an instrument for monetary policy. We proposed for the next, as of the next 24 months, a reduction of the target, and we had a reduction of 5.4%, which was strange because it's been 20 years this had not been complied with. Now they're more demanding than before.
The monetary policy and central bank decisions are made in the Monetary Policy Committee that took place 4 times a year. And then we doubled the number of meetings. We reduced the frequency. We went to 8 meetings a year and decided to improve the central bank's communications by perfecting our monetary policy report with clearer explanations of the reasons why, using our models, explaining the projections. We began to work with periodic meetings with the specialized journalists, analysts, foreign investors every 6 months, routinely. And again, we tried to explain the decisions, explaining where we were heading, evaluating our performance. We took over March of 2020, and 13th of March, we had the first COVID case in Uruguay. Clearly, the monetary policy was as expansive as health conditions required. We in Uruguay, as Carlos was saying, lived COVID different from other countries did. We were never locked down except for 1 week at the beginning, and then citizens in Uruguay always, with slight restrictions, had activities with slight restrictions, but we were able to choose the way in which we wanted to live COVID. We were able to go out, we could go to work, we could remain at home if we wanted to work at home. Each Uruguayan, with a concept that the president called responsible freedom, was performed, and the impact of COVID on the Uruguayan economy was significant, was serious, but not with the breadth and perseverance that we saw in other economies. Throughout that time, where the monetary policy was as expansive as it had to be, and we didn't have enough time to focus on inflation, but we carried out all these changes that I was mentioning at the beginning in the change of institutions, and the agents began to trust or believe in our work. The president of the bank before, Yamin, repeatedly spoke of the commitment it had with the inflation, and that we were going to make it and how we were going to do it, and the fight against inflation. And that permeated throughout the Uruguayan society, and the citizens gradually began to demand less inflation. Uruguay is a country, I don't know if you've been there, but it's a relatively expensive country. It's confusing for the citizens. Uruguay is expensive with the evolution of prices, but that began to be understood gradually with the different economic agents that began to understand that conviction mentioned by the central bank turned into facts once the COVID finished in September 2021 with a gradual increase in their interest rates. It was the first central bank, or one of the first in the world, except maybe for Costa Rica, who began to increase the interest rate. And Russia's invasion and the consequent pressures internationally gave us a chance, because we already had high inflation. Uruguay, as I mentioned, had an inflation at 8, anchoring the expectations at 8. And the fact that in the rest of the economies, they had to develop anti-inflationary and monetary restrictive policies allowed us to be as restrictive as we wanted, as required by the conditions, without drawing attention to ourselves. And that was a tremendous opportunity. And what the worst thing that could have happened to us, and that was our goal, was that when the process ended in the world, because all countries continue to have the expectations anchored despite the increased inflation, where sooner or later they were going to reach the level of the expectations, and the inflation was going to converge. The worst that could happen to us was that when that process ended, Uruguay would continue with its expectations. If we look back now, we have an inflation of around 5% with expectations below 6%, so within the range. Our projections, as well as all the expectation measures we have, place the inflation in Uruguay for the next 24 months within the range and on the axis of the range. And that's important because from what we've analyzed in our research department, the expectation formation mechanism in Uruguay is 25% of rational expectations and 75% adaptation. So all the time, the 16 months, we've been reaching the target every month. And that's not only one more month of inflation within the range, but another strike against the inflation expectations going forward. And if this process continues in Uruguay, we're about to have an elections, and next Sunday we're going to have an election. And whoever wins in next Sunday, with the 16 months we've had, plus the 24 months of projections, will determine a significantly important moment in Uruguay, and then we'll be able to take the next quality step to eliminate that cold I was mentioning, which is getting lower and lower, and it's going to take the range to 3%, where an economy with the progress that we have in Uruguay, with the credibility that we have in the Uruguayan economy, and the credit qualification of its economy, and the revenue levels, it's going to be very positive. So that's a little bit of the story of our situation. Yes, thank you very much. And now let's go to the questions. We have many topics to cover, so I suggest that we try to make quick answers so that we have enough time to cover all the topics that we have in the very limited time we have available. I think that maybe we could begin by talking briefly about the institutional framework, which is something all of you touched upon. I think that all of you have different institutional frameworks, like in the case of Bolivia, Edwin, you spoke of a coordination process with the finance ministry. In difficult times, in times of economic crisis, as you're going through in Bolivia right now, how much freedom does the central bank feel it has to impose its viewpoint in the government, in that institutional framework? Well, I think that what's more important is to talk about the limits that the central bank has. I think that the need is to actually determine the objectives in economic policy and the macroeconomic results. So that would necessarily bring us to a process of coordination. Of course, the fiscal sector has different goals to accomplish, especially related to expenditures. I'm talking about investment expenditure, basically. And the Central Bank of Bolivia, I'm sorry, his microphone is cutting off. Every time he moves, he cuts off the microphone. But pointing to what would be the macroeconomic results. So from that point of view, I believe that these two last matters, just to mention a recent period, has allowed us to generate processes whereby we've been able to maintain the expansion and I'm sorry, very difficult to follow him because his microphone is cutting off, both internally as well as externally. Internally, due to all the political conflicts that I've mentioned, this year we've seen other restrictions linked to the environmental issue, for example. But this coordination process and the establishment of macroeconomic goals for the central bank, all the operational aspects of the results reached in the financial cycle have to date allowed us to have these results of expansion and monetary stability. Thank you very much. Carlos, do you have any experience in Paraguay with the institutional framework that you spoke of? You spoke of the importance of institutional strengthening. Is the central bank's independence accepted in the Paraguayan politics? Well, I'm going to talk about the Ministry of Economics and Finance. Former president of the central bank. Good afternoon and welcome. Jorge Corbalán is here as well. Jorge, raise your hand so they know who you are. He's our representative at the IMF. At the central bank, Jorge was 5 years. He reached his mandate, and Carlos Fernandez was another 5 years. He ended his mandate at the central bank. My predecessor, Jose Cantero, ended his 5 years in the central bank. And just in case, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen to me, but I hope I'll follow the same tradition as they followed, which is sometimes deep-rooted in the community, in the society. I think that the political system took advantage of the benefits of a sound economic institution with a sound macroeconomic position. And I believe that in the electoral platforms, in the political programs, not having that as an asset is something which goes against any political initiative that you have in society today. As I mentioned before, pre-pandemic, the question was, what's all this effort for? Why are we doing all this, strengthening the economic institutions? But after that, we had all the possible stress tests, the most severe stress tests. We tested all the economic instruments we had, and the results were all positive. And they were effective because we had built the necessary buffers. We had strengthened the credibility of the fiscal as well as monetary instruments, and therefore the people knew that that was going to be used adequately. In other words, once the shock required it, when the conditions required it, the policies were going to be there to assist. When the shock's impact ended, then we would return to normal, the economic normality to establish the balance. So with the Minister of Economy, with whom we're friends for years and we've worked together for years, I can go and have a beer without a problem because I know he's not going to ask me for anything more than to pay for the beer. So that's really something that we value. And I think that in the country, we've established the conditions of sufficiency. I think that today we have the economic conditions in order, a low, stable inflation, sound economic growth, which we've had for years, responsible tax authorities that are recovering their balance in a programmed manner. We have stability with the fiscal and tax policies, which are important. So I think that we're in a position to take that quality leap the country needs in the social and economic development. The sufficiency conditions and necessary reforms to impact the productivity. And we're doing that also. Thank you, Carlos. And Washington, I was interested in hearing what you said about the degree of independence established by the central bank in Uruguay from the very beginning, and that it is an institution that enjoys a great deal of public trust. However, Uruguay is a country that shows a relatively high degree of dollarization. So how do you explain that apparent paradox between the degree of trust in the central bank and the dollarization of the economy? Well, due to the crisis, because the Uruguayan, right or wrong, understands, but in the imagination of the community, they feel that the dollar protects them because the financial crises and the exchange rate crisis led to serious devaluation processes. And in the two events of the 60s as well as the 80s, and in 2002, with the fixed exchange rates or semi-fixed exchange rates, and that loss suffered by the Uruguayan citizen, that loss in the value of its savings were such, or maybe the increase in the price of their debts, of course, because the mortgage and the banking loans were affected, leads them to have a culture in which makes them believe that the dollar protects them. For the Uruguayan, it's difficult to understand. And it's difficult for us to explain. And it would lead to too much debate that the appreciation processes of our local currency as a result of what happens when there's a weakening. Because there's one thing that could be changed in that mentality, because in Brazil we were able to see how it changed with the real. And today the Brazilian currency enjoys a tremendous trust amongst the society, like the pandemic, responsible freedom. We don't impose anything, nor do we do anything, we convince. And that makes us much stronger. And as the Uruguayan inflation drops and the Uruguayan understands that their savings are worth something and that savings in the local currency are protected by the low inflation, then they're going to be more prone to use our currency. Clearly, the central bank has promoting a series of measures to promote or encourage the use of the local currency or the de-dollarization of the economy. But it takes long. It's a process. When the pain is big, the healing is longer. Thank you very much. Yes, Washington talked to us about the aspect of Uruguay where there was no lockdown, while in Bolivia, I believe there was another peculiar situation where they did not had a high inflation after COVID. What do you think that was due to, Edwin? Well, I would say that basically the Bolivian Central Bank has been generating in time all the necessary policies for the use of the national currency. We have what we call the use of the national currency in Bolivia, which is above 90% if we just see the credit, where on the side of the credit, it's actually 100%. I think we've made enormous efforts, especially with non-tradable operations. I think that that's a fundamental aspect and probably one of the merits that we have in Bolivia in recent years, because it has allowed for all the distributive processes with a complete financial system that's stable, and the people trust that that's the right use of their currency in all operations. I think that this is one of the reasons. On the other hand, I think that it's a complicated issue, the question of COVID and the national economy. It was a year during which there was a coup, and this situation has been very difficult because we were facing a political situation which has made the economy much harder and the recovery process even harder, this has meant a series of coordination between the monetary and fiscal to take the growth rate and the stability required. But I think that that's probably the most important asset that has existed in the Bolivian economy in economic terms. Thank you, Edwin. Carlos, you spoke of the climate change and the climate shock in Paraguay, which punished the economy. Globally, central banks have been giving priority, growing priority to all actions related to climate change. From your point of view, what do you think should be the role of the central bank dealing with the climate change?
Sí,
Well,
nosotros
yes,
hemos sufrido
we have
no solo como
not
estaba
only
la pandemia,
suffered, as I mentioned,
hemos sufrido dos
from the
choques
pandemic, we've had
climáticos
two
importantes
climate
en
shocks that have been
2019
very
y
important,
2022.
2019,
Fueron dos
2020, and
años
2022,
de sequía
2
importantes.
years of
Este año
significant droughts,
también
and this year as
es un
well.
año de sequía
We've had
importante. Y aquí yo creo
an important
importante, antes
drought.
de pasar a
And I
responder
think that what's
específicamente tu
important,
pregunta,
before I
creo que
answer
lo
your question
importante es
specifically, I think that what's important here
mediante
is that
un marco de
through
políticas
a
económicas
series
saludables
of healthy
permitir
economic
que la
policies,
economía
we allow the
encuentre las
economy to
condiciones de
find
resiliencia adecuadas
the
para hacer frente a los
adequate
choques.
resilience conditions to face the shocks.
Y en el 2022
In
nosotros tuvimos, como te
2022,
había comentado,
as I
una
mentioned,
pérdida de
we had a
60%,
loss of
digamos, de nuestra
60%
producción
of our
principal producto
uh,
de
production of
exportación
our
del
main
país,
export product in the country, which is the
eh,
soybean.
probablemente 15 años atrás hubiera
Probably
significado una
15
caída
years ago, it
violenta
might
de
have
la
been a
economía
violent
cuando el
drop in
sector
our
primario
economy when
representaba
the
más
primary
del
sector was
30%
close to or
del
over
producto. Hoy en
30%
día
of the GDP,
significa menos
while
del 10%.
today it's less
Y
than
otros motores,
10%.
digamos,
And there are other
funcionando,
drivers that are working
mitigan ese riesgo. O sea, la
that
economía se ha
mitigate the
diversificado
risk.
porque
So
las
the
señales
economy has
económicas estaban
diversified
preparadas para
because that was the
ocurriera.
necessary, the
La
signals
economía se ha
were
ido
that this
cayendo.
had to be done, and the economy did not
En este
fall.
año tenemos también una
This year,
sequía
we are
importante.
also having
La
a very
generación de
significant
energía
drought.
eléctrica está
The
cayendo
electric
aproximadamente
energy is
25%.
dropping about
La economía
25%.
va a crecer este
The
año
economy is going to grow this year
a un ritmo de 4%.
at a rate of
Creo
about
que
4%
tenemos un
because we
sector
have
secundario que está
a secondary
dinámico, el
sector
sector
which is
servicios
quite
también va a
dynamic. The
estar, la
service
generación
sector
de
is
empleo,
also
por lo
dynamic.
tanto,
The job
sigue a un
generation
ritmo
continues at
adecuado.
an adequate
Y
pace.
así como el driver de
So just
crecimiento
as the
del año
growth
pasado
driver
fue
last
fue la
year
demanda externa, este año está siendo
from
la
the
demanda
external
interna.
demand,
Entonces,
this year it's an internal
hacer
demand.
que la economía de
So
alguna manera opere
somehow
en
the
un
economy has to
marco
operate
donde
within a
los shocks
framework where
pueden
the
afectar a determinados
shocks
sectores,
can
pero que haya
affect
otros
certain
motores
sectors, but there
que
should be
sean
other drivers
lo
that can
suficientemente saludables,
be
digamos, como
healthy
para
enough
sostener el
to
ritmo de crecimiento económico. Yo
sustain
creo
the
que
rate,
eso es
the
importante y
pace.
tiene
And
que
I
ver
think that that's
también con las
important.
señales
I think that
que
that
vemos
also has
basadas
to
en la
do with
política
the
económica. Respecto, digamos, al
signals we
clima,
see in the economic
sin duda,
policy. As for
como
climate,
nos demuestran,
we
digamos, los
realize
últimos
that
años,
just
cada
as
2
we've
años
seen these
tenemos un
last 2 years, every 2
problema
years we seem to have a
climático,
problem
digamos,
with the
en el
climate
país y
in the
y en
country
el mundo, y por lo tanto
and in the
tenemos que
world.
tomar
So I think that we have
conciencia
to
de eso,
be
incorporar
aware of
esos
this and
elementos,
add
digamos,
those
en las
elements
políticas económicas.
into
Nosotros
our
en Centro Banco
economic
Central
policies.
tenemos
So in the
toda
central
su
bank,
tradición, así
we
como el Banco
have,
Central de Uruguay, el
just like the
sistema
central bank in Uruguay, a
financiero
whole
como,
financial overview
digamos,
system where we
de alguna forma
somehow
dentro de lo que son todos los
fit
estándares
within all
internacionales
the
de
international
supervisión
standards
basada en riesgo.
of
Y en ese
supervision or
proceso de
risk-based
supervisión
supervision.
basado
And
en
in that
riesgo,
risk-based
el tema,
supervision,
digamos,
the
climático es
climate
un
issue
tema
is one
que está presente y
which is
fundamental. O sea,
present.
incorporar el riesgo climático
So we
dentro del riesgo de
include the
crédito es
climate
un
risk into the credit
elemento
risk
fundamental y
as a
urgente en estos
fundamental
momentos.
element,
Y también
which we
con
included
nuestro
in our
Departamento de
model. And
Economía
together
estamos
with the Ministry of
trabajando
the
y
Economy, we're working.
probablemente este año,
Maybe
a fin
this year,
de año,
hopefully
tengamos
towards the
pronto
end,
esa
we'll
revisión
have
que tiene que ver con
uh,
taxonomía verde,
all the green
también de alguna
taxonomy
forma
ready,
va a operar en un
which
sentido
is somehow
correcto
going to
en
operate
los términos en los que estoy
adequately,
mencionando.
as I'm explaining. I see. And Washington, we'd like to touch on the new technologies with you. The questions like digital currency in central banks. How do we regulate the digital currency, the private digital currencies? Could you tell us what you think, what's your experience in the Uruguayan Central Bank about what you're doing, adapting to these rapid changes? In 2016, I think Uruguay did a pilot test of a digital currency, of the e-peso, it was called. It was about a few months, 6 months, in a closed circuit. It worked at that time quite well. It was a technology which today would be obsolete, but at the time it worked very well. And after that, we realized that Uruguay enacted a law of financial inclusion in 2017, forcing all Uruguayans to have a banking account. and all financial institutions to open accounts for everybody. So we all collect our salaries, our retirement, our rents, all income, all revenue through the financial system. We realized that it was better to have that critical mass to make it more usable. And that's how we've been promoting the rapid payment system. We set aside the digital currency. Uruguay today has a rapid payment system, which is similar to some, it's called Toque. It's been working for 3 months. It's working quite adequately through person business transfers. We're beginning system of open finances from the regulatory point of view, again, promoting the private sector so that they follow this. We define rapid payment and the inclusion of innovation and technology in the financial system. And there's a criteria in open finances where the central bank will not have the need to occupy the space the private sector should occupy. So we've defined our objectives. We've defined what we feel is better for the society. And if the private sector joins, welcome. If they develop it, wonderful. That's what we want. If they don't, then the central bank has agreed to do it. And the private sector has been working, has been generating innovations, and we hope this will lead to better prices and better development for the citizens. Technology is an irreversible process. We can't deny it. We can't make believe it doesn't exist. Recently, in Parliament in Uruguay, we approved a law of virtual assets, which generates the necessary framework for the generation of digital currency, and it gives the central bank the authority to supervise and authorize. And what we try to do is simply do the best way to follow the process. Now, going from digital currency and more traditional technology of the gold reserves, what has Bolivia done to increase the gold reserves through the purchase of gold produced locally? And that has apparently helped the central bank to increase its reserves and face the recent dollar demand. Can you describe the process? Tell us a little bit how it's been acting. Yeah, I think this is an important characteristic of the central bank, terms allowing it to be a more dynamic central bank, if you wish, not a passive bank, in terms of managing only the regulatory problems of the fiscal monetary policy, but participating in generating resources to stabilize or increase all aspects related to payment systems within the international system in particular. Bolivia is an important gold producer in the region. I think that that's one of the attributes that allows the central bank to, since the last management of the last administration, generated a series of skills to purchase and collect the gold, and then the refinancing process in terms of what's called standards of the international market, which is called, I'm sorry, I'm really having a hard time with his microphone. It's very difficult. Half of his words are cut off. This is a process that we've done in a more effective way, and we have an efficiency level of about one, or I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. This is a half explanation of what he's saying because I'm only getting half of what he's saying. In other scenarios, it might not be much, but it's been quite significant for our economy. So the procurement process and the refining process and the conversion into currency has allowed the economy to have another dynamic, beginning to feel a new productive factor, which in this case would be the mining sector's participation in the economy. And these two significant elements, strengthening the liquidity of our international. We are coming to the end of our session. We have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to ask our participants to use a minute each for the last to give a counsel to central banks in the region based on your experience. What advice would you give central banks, Edwin? Well, quite a challenging question. I'm not here to give advice. I think they could probably advise me better, but I think that an important aspect is to read what's happening as objectively as possible. I think that there are policy designs in the international monetary field that are very significant that are not necessarily or should not necessarily be used in an economy that has the quality of understanding what this could be for an economy in general. I would say that from this, to have the possibility of applying these policies, but I think that there's the other element which I feel is fundamental, the question of coordination. I think that it's important to participate in all strategic aspects in the development of economy, and in our case, we do it side by side, complementing the efforts of the public sector, trying to improve the living conditions of the population. Thank you very much, Edwin. Carlos, 1 minute, your advice. Well, clearly, I don't feel I'm in a position to advise anyone. All I can say, it's a spirit of collegiateness. Well, all I can say is to share what was successful for us, and which is not much different from what I mentioned in my presentation. Autonomy of the central bank, a good government design, and the autonomy is based on how we've designed governance in the central bank. So I would say something that's even more important, and I'm going to explain it this way. In the year 2000, the central bank had 1,400 workers, more or less, and today we have about 700 and some. In the year 2000, of these persons, a small percentage had university studies. Today, a large percentage, I would say a majority, have masters and doctorate from the best universities abroad. So you ask me what would define the independence of the central bank? I would probably say that it's neither the legal framework, which is good and it's helpful, it's neither the respect for the political process, which we think is important, and not even the will of a board that is outside the political cycle, let's say. It's the conviction of the workers who have the adequate education level and the technical conviction that avoids excesses in the economic policy decisions. And I think that's been fundamental for us in the central bank. The autonomy, the training of its human resources, and a more operational inflation goals based on the institutional credibility, generating an adequate anchor for inflation control. Thank you very much. Washington, what about you? Well, I don't think it's an advice, but following the same line of Carlos's presentation, I would say that all of us are from football countries or countries that like the football and rugby in some countries. Yeah, but I think football is more for Latin America. We in Uruguay say, and I think everyone says, that we have to play in the field that we got. The floor conditions can't be an excuse for winning or losing. So the institutional strength, as Carlos said, as he mentioned, but as public managers, we have to be pragmatic in decisions and in policies but very orthodox in our mandate. Never forget the mandate of the central bank. Each one has his own mandate, but that's what motivates us. And that's what we have to focus on, playing in whatever conditions we're in, because we can't change the conditions, and being practical and complying with our mandate. Thank you very much. And I believe that these are very valuable advices. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your experience with us so generously. And thank you very much to the IDB for organizing this event and for inviting us. Thank you all for being here.